What makes a video game sequel good or bad anyway? Well, I suppose one way to make one good involves sticking to the first game's roots and keeping your design quality high, sort of like Portal 2 to the original Portal. But diverging does not necessarily mean your game will be bad as a sequel. You can just make something good, and its status as a good sequel will usually shake itself out. If you want to draw the obvious parallel, I think you might have to go a little further. Something that stands in opposition to the original. Something you might even go so far as to say, if you are the overdramatic sort, betrays the original. That's the no-go zone in the just make something good suggestion, and today I'm going to make the argument that BioShock Infinite is a game that betrays the original in several ways. I am definitely overdramatic, but hear me out anyway. Please? As a brief note, I will not be covering BioShock 2 in this video. It feels like much more of a generic sequel, if that makes sense. Not without themes, but more interested in being another game in Rapture than having something new going on. It also was developed by a different team. Ultimately, this ends up making it feel like the Drakengard 2 of BioShock, a reference that will surely be significantly more resonant. To me. But I guess I make these videos for me before I make them for you, whether I try to or not. Let's start off by talking about gameplay mechanics. This isn't really much of a gameplay channel under most circumstances, but I think this is very important for what I'm trying to say here, because it's a little weird how these two games seem to have such different guiding principles. Now, a thing that BioShock really wants you to know, and I got out my old hard copy of the PC version, as you can see here. See, PC DVD, yeah. Is that you have a lot of ways to be able to deal with any fight in the game. Now, let's take a look inside the slipcover here. Might be a little bit hard to see this, especially because of all the glare and the aspect ratio, so I'll read this off to you. It's got a picture here of a Big Daddy, and you're seeing Jack's perspective. He's got his machine gun out there. And starting in the top left, it's given us a bunch of suggestions on ways that we can fight this thing. It says, hack his own security system and turn it against him. Burn him up with homemade Molotov cocktails. A bit of a stretch, but yeah. Brainwash him to become your personal bodyguard. I do enjoy that. Torment him with a plague of insects. Yes, everybody loves bees. Booby trap healing machines and watch them blow up in his face. Actually, they release a poisonous gas, I believe, not what it says there. Lead him and his comrades to water and zap them all with 1,000 volts. Send him flying into the ceiling to knock him senseless. Invent your own ammo types to prey on his vulnerabilities. Or just find them in the world. It doesn't say that part. Take research photos of him to learn his weakness. Freeze him solid and shatter him with a smack of your wrench. I don't think you could do that to these guys. I think they were actually a little bit too sturdy for that. Light him on fire and launch heat-seeking missiles at him. Usually you just let him die from the fire, but I'm not even going to get into that too much. And catch his grenades in midair and toss them back at him. This one isn't carrying a grenade launcher, but yeah, some of the Big Daddies do. Anyway, back of the package here. We'll read some of the blurb for you. BioShock is a shooter unlike any you've ever played, loaded with weapons and tactics never seen. You'll have a complete arsenal at your disposal, from simple revolvers to grenade launchers and chemical throwers, but you'll also be forced to genetically modify your DNA to create an even more deadly weapon. You. Injectable plasmids give you superhuman powers, blast electrical currents into water to electrocute multiple enemies, or freeze them solid and obliterate them with the swing of a wrench. No encounter ever plays out the same, and no two gamers will play the game the same way. They really wanted you to be sold on this idea that you had a lot of options in this game. At least when you were looking at the package in the store. People love options, even if they'll never use them. When I recently played Black Mesa, I literally never used the trip mines or the snarks, but I think it was pretty cool that the game gave me the option to. BioShock delivers in this regard. BioShock gives you a large array of abilities, both passive and active, and a multitude of guns which each have multiple types of ammunition. While the basic ammunition types of the pistol and machine gun are a bit bland, armor-piercing and anti-personnel rounds have specific and extremely obvious applications, the other weapons give you a bit more variety. Perhaps most noteworthy are the proximity mines you can launch from your grenade launcher, and the tripwire traps your extremely Half-Life aping sniper crossbow can set. Honestly, messaging aside, the Half-Life franchise is more or less what the BioShock games want to be almost entirely. But on top of this, you also get access to a wide variety of passive abilities known as tonics, and active magic-like skills called plasmids. Among these, you have the staple elemental abilities like Winter Blast for ice, Electro Bolt for lightning, Insect Swarm for bees, and Incinerate for fire. You know, the 4 basic food groups. It's like the defaults for a black mage in a Final Fantasy game, or the basic magic you can use in Phantasy Star Online if you want to be really underwhelmed unless you're a force. But you also have some more off-the-wall stuff, like an ability that lets you paint a target to be attacked by the local security systems, a move to get a Big Daddy to be your ally, or telekinesis. Telekinesis lets you turn just about anything into a deadly weapon just by throwing it around, including catching bombs thrown by the Nitro Splicer enemies back at them, or even at other enemies, or to pick up various traps left around the area and reposition them into a more favorable location for you for an upcoming encounter, or in some cases, even to collect them as ammunition for later use. And of course, who can deny the fun and humor of the prospect of killing someone by flinging a first aid kit at them? Tonics let you build your character to use a handful of strategies. Sure, some of them can be of variable effectiveness depending on where you are, with some even proving outright dangerous to you, but you're able to swap them out at specific stations, along with switching what plasmids you have equipped, so your character building choices are not as restricted as if it were a true skill tree in a game with no resets. Which are rarer than I'm assuming because I can't name one offhand right now. There are limitations to what you can do, but you have enough space to equip enough things that you can have some variety, plus they enable all kinds of fun builds, such as giving yourself benefits for hacking any machine, or counterattacking your enemies with a wave of lightning that I find always causes more problems than it solves if we're being honest, but it's cool and it's an option you can build and play around if your playstyle is different from mine. While there's probably an obvious dominant strategy for BioShock, I can't deny the fun of simply loading myself up with wrench abilities and going on a complete rampage. Call me the thing, cause it's clobbering time, son! Or setting up an instant death zone with way more landmines than is even remotely necessary. Or even hacking security systems in the area to go after my enemies. Oh, right, did I even mention that you could do that? I guess it came up in an offhanded way. Well, you can go even further by hacking the healing stations to not only get a discount for yourself, but make it so enemies using them instead get killed. Nobody likes it when your enemies heal themselves in any game, so here's a way to punish that actually works for once. It's more satisfying than casting Reflect on the Sanctuary Keeper in Final Fantasy X, that's for sure. Partway through the game, you get access to a camera, which lets you take pictures of enemies to research them, earning damage bonuses against them, and, in some cases, earning new passive abilities via tonics, or even unique buffs against certain enemies to make certain strategies against them more viable, or just making it so you almost never want for medkits. Although that's definitely accomplished in a disgusting sounding way. Aside from the scenario you obtain the camera in, you're not required to use it ever, but it's a very helpful tool. There are some parts of using it that are a little underwhelming, notably the attempts to get you to get trickier photos due to its scoring system simply don't push you enough, making me wonder why the devs even bothered. Unfortunately, I tend to find that the plasmids are less powerful than the weapons and more limiting than the tonics, because I always feel compelled to carry Electro Bolt, Incinerate, and Telekinesis just for negotiating with the environment and being able to go explore everything, but they still provide an interesting variety of stuff you can do. The ability to make security systems target your enemies seriously affects the momentum of some of the bigger and more difficult fights. Winter Blast lets you freeze enemies for easy wrench kills without having to go through the obscenely long reload or ammo swap animation of the chemical thrower you were using with electric gel already because it's curiously strong. And come on, who doesn't love shooting bees at people? Furthermore, a lot of them supplement your weapons to a level that I'd even go so far as to refer to as being combo pieces as opposed to being your main damage dealers. Remember how early on Fontaine teaches you to shock enemies before giving them a wrench beatdown? Oh, spoiler alert for later in the game, by the way, Atlas is actually Frank Fontaine. The problem here is that, again, even on the hard difficulty, I find this game to be easy enough that bullheaded, inelegant, raw aggression with the first few weapons tends to win the day just fine, and in the rare circumstances where it doesn't, I can usually still find an extremely low dexterity solution. As much as this is all very cool, I do tend to find that very little of it is truly useful. Ammo for these weapons is plentiful enough, usually, but you don't usually need most of it as the use cases for a lot of weapons, especially the more gimmicky kind, are usually in more of the cool but pointless when you have the basics category. Even on the higher difficulties, I find that the actual use cases for a lot of the goofier stuff remains narrow when you can deal with most encounters using your pistol, Tommy gun, and shotgun. And wrench with the right tonic build. Occasionally, you might consider busting out the grenade launcher for a high damage shot if you think you can stomach the dogshit fire and reload rate, but everything else is mostly just there for fun. The Chem Thrower, I think, does have the decency to supplant the Incinerate Plasmid when it comes to burning things in the world, but the same is not true of its Electric Gel replacing the Electro Bolt for world interactions, meaning you will keep using that anyway. The Crossbow... I simply did not find the crossbow useful when I already had the other weapons to hand, some of which I had good upgrades for. In fact, it's quite easy to get along with just the fully upgraded pistol thanks to its gigantic 24-shot clip. I assume the incredibly goofy belt-based design of the upgrade helps to confuse your enemies into taking more damage. However, who fucking cares if I don't use 99% of the tools the game gives to me that are there for fun more than anything? It's cool that these are available. The game gives you plenty of opportunities to use them, and when you run into those places and you cannot do the thing, it's because you just didn't get enough ammo yet. You have limited plasmid slots, but past a point, they are not so severely limited as to be an issue. And of course, the order of the day here is in the sheer number of options. Again, the game is openly advertising this as a selling point so big that it's on the inside flap of the slipcover on the PC version and the blurb on the back of the box. Clearly, they couldn't skimp out here or offer you no more options than just your basic form of beating the hell out of your enemies beyond what they tell you about on the package. Meanwhile, BioShock Infinite features a pretty decent array of staple FPS weapons, but you're only allowed to equip 2 at a time. Technically, you have many options, but not all at once. This presents a few issues. If your intended strategy relies on certain weapons, you have to make sure that you carry them with you. Most of these weapons cannot do anything special besides using their primary fire, in fact maybe even none of them. This variety of weapons is also partially a smokescreen, lest you think this means that your options would still be pretty wide. Many of the weapons are more or less the same as others in the game, but in one of 2 different versions used by one of the 2 different factions. So, just looking at how many weapons you have available will fool you. From a world-building stance, I get it, but as a gameplay feature, it's a problem. Or it would be if it weren't for the sheer amount of ammunition that Elizabeth can conjure out of the ether. We'll get to that. But if it weren't for that, you would encounter certain areas where you could get ammo for, say, one machine gun and not the other, because you're fighting a specific faction. Additionally, your weapons can be upgraded at upgrade shops throughout the game, and, for example, upgrades to what the game refers to as a machine gun, wielded by the Founders, are not the same as those for what the game refers to as a repeater, wielded by the Vox Populi, because they are different gun types and have different stats. Despite the fact that the game identifies both of them as being variants of a Ralston reciprocating rifle, which goes a long way to suggest that, at their heart, these guns are the same. I suppose each faction modified every single one of their copies of this gun in the exact same way, but I can't imagine, say, the Vox Pops meddling with theirs so much that the mods you apply to the Founders version couldn't easily be fitted to those too, nor that they couldn't probably use the same ammo. Truth be told, the upgrade system doesn't make much sense if you switch weapons ever, because why should you always refine the same exact modified pistol or whatever? Obviously, it's because this is an acceptable break from reality, but gosh dang it, I demand realism from my game about parallel universes and floating steampunk cities held up by magic with a name meant to make it not sound like magic. Mostly, this just means you reach a point in the game where your best source of ammo is to scavenge bullets from the trash or to buy them at a vending machine, or switch to the Vox weapons, which are only on par with your current guns at best, or if you've been upgrading the Founders guns, are weaker. And of course, if you wish to upgrade them, you'll have to shell out a lot to buy those upgrades. I think, for example, the Repeaters upgrades are more expensive than the Machine Guns upgrades, but I don't remember, I didn't look it up, and having all the DLC, probably because I bought a franchise bundle at one point, has kinda messed things up a little. Hope you've been judicious with those Silver Eagles and have cast possession on literally every vending machine you've ever found to goose the numbers a little. Also, my advice to a first-time player would probably be to add the game to your library on Steam before any expansions, and wait to add those until after you beat it to preserve the original experience without any pay-to-win features as closely as possible, or just wait to buy that stuff until later, the latter being your main option if you're not playing this on Steam. From a visual design perspective, I also just find the guns a little less interesting than the ones in BioShock, where many of the weapons are clearly hashed together from scrap in a way that makes them feel truly unique. My weird crossbow made of random junk from a tinkerer's desk is cool because you aren't likely to see any others like it in Rapture or elsewhere. I think there's a few others you can pick up for ammo, but they're not a mass-produced weapon, you know? Meanwhile, everything in BioShock Infinite is clearly a mass-produced gun. It's a little drier. This doesn't really affect any of what I'm going to say with the rest of the video, but I just wanted to point out that I think the grenade launcher, chemical thrower, and crossbow in BioShock look neat as hell. Plasmids are replaced by what are called Vigors. They're pretty much the same concept, but there are only 8 of them and you have them equipped all at the same time. Unfortunately, going up to equipping 8 spells versus 6 is not a commensurate increase in variety of strategy against the reduction caused by going to 2 weapons versus 6. The camera not being a weapon as such, and the melee weapon really not being a thing that I think should count, especially since it is technically always equipped in Infinite. I do like the fact that the game builds very heavily on a concept seen basically only in an early cutscene in BioShock 1, where injecting a plasmid has some very harsh effects on your mind and body until you actually properly incorporate the ability. Drinking a new Vigor causes Booker to suffer a very strong, and usually quite frightening, hallucination as he acquires his new ability. It's not gameplay related at all, but it is cool. What I don't like is the reduced array of effects offered to you by these. In the order you unlock them, you can possess machines and later people with an upgrade, throw fiery grenades, attack people with crows because you're too edgy for bees and begin and end your name with a capital and lowercase x. You can launch your enemies into the air, you can electrocute them, you can bull rush them, you can summon a wave to wash them away or pull them in with a watery tentacle, or you can create a barrier. In addition to their main method of use, you can lay a trap with all but a select few of your spells. If I recall correctly, it's 5 out of 8 that let you set traps, and many of them share some functionality. Certainly, the trap-creating spells all have the same landmine aspect to their mechanics, which makes them feel very similar to each other. And for someone who preferred to fight with weapons in the original BioShock, using them feels even worse than in that game, which is ignorable up until you encounter the handful of enemies which the game all but requires you to fight with magic. The longer you go on, the more tech you get to make your weaponry so much more powerful than your magic, and Lord have mercy if you made the mistake of buying any sort of special edition of this game, because that gives you access to a piece of gear giving you the electric punch effect, making your melee attacks have a 70% chance to stun an enemy for 4 seconds. It's less practical on higher difficulties, or so I'd assume, but with a piece of gear giving me greatly enhanced lunging range on my melee gear, I was able to almost forego guns entirely against anything on foot after a point, leaping between enemies and delivering lightning-powered beatdowns like Zeus himself in the middle of the most oversized steampunk bar brawl you've ever seen. This combination allowed me to even fearlessly punch out the mechanized Patriots, giant minigun-toting mechas that ordinarily take so much damage as to require multiple shots from even the rocket launcher to scrap. Speaking of enemies that want you to fight them in a specific way, we have the Handymen, who are the replacement for BioShock's iconic Big Daddies. You'll notice that the Handymen don't really show up anywhere in the game's advertising iconography in the way that the Big Daddies did. And sure, I'm not expecting the same extent because BioShock Infinite wants very badly to be a character-driven game in a way that BioShock 1 was fully content to let linger in the background, but it's kind of a surprise. Or it is until you realize their design sucks. Horrifying when you know the backstory, but otherwise kind of a mess. But forget about the character design, what about the game design aspect? Well, strangely enough for this series, when you fight a handyman, you have an actual part of its body that is specifically worth targeting, that being its heart as opposed to its head. Everywhere else you do an amount of damage that I can really only call inadequate. This is monstrously frustrating, but it's more noteworthy that I don't think this type of fight design appears anywhere else in the first 2 games. In and of itself, it's probably not a bad design, and I somewhat value a more frantic fight from this franchise, but I somehow never felt like they were fun to fight. Interestingly, you fight only a very few of them in the game, less than 5 by my count. Guess what, my lovelies? I'm here to interrupt this brain jackass who's talking about how this game is too easy for her to let her know about the survivor difficulty in BioShock Remastered. Yeah, here's a little unscripted bit. I had never played the survivor difficulty in BioShock Remastered, and in fact, when I wrote this part of the script, I didn't even know it was a thing. I started streaming this, and let me tell you, this difficulty really gives this game some teeth. If it weren't for the fact that dying were so consequence-free, This would actually kind of be exactly what I was looking for out of BioShock for a more difficult experience. Especially early on, I was downright struggling and absolutely unsure as to what I was going to do in some encounters because I felt so starved for resources. I've only started this, so I've only gotten up to kind of early in Neptune's Bounty. I wonder how hard this is going to get by the end. But what I can say for sure is that I think I'm going to be using absolutely everything at my disposal to its fullest, and that makes me quite happy. Then again, I think BioShock in general is a series that isn't good at actually making hard battles. By which I mean most of them are not actually hard most of the time unless it's because they're battles of attrition or janky escort missions. Phew, talk about tautology. Janky escort missions. Point is, most fights in BioShock aren't really all that hard as long as you can get creative. My memory only really points to one truly hard fight in BioShock 1, which is a Big Daddy very early on in the Arcadia area. It's this, like, angular hallway with a revival point, and this dude just beats me like a redheaded mule every time because resources are just kind of thin at that point. Especially with grenades feeling too valuable to use due to the challenge of replacing them for the time being, and the room isn't shaped in a way that's all that amenable to you moving around. Thankfully, I can just revive right nearby and overcome the fight by sheer attrition, meaning this still ain't no Half-Life, but if you wanted to do this without losing your brass balls achievement, you'd have to actually think a little. That style of fight is less available in BioShock Infinite, and it's a crying shame. Considering the advertised philosophy of the first game, which admittedly also failed quite often, it's just a shame how bland a lot of the fights feel in both of these games, but BioShock Infinite especially. The doer and the thinker. No allowance for the other. That's not what he was thinking about in 72 at all, never mind. BioShock Infinite introduces the concept of tears, letting you warp things in from other dimensions thanks to Elizabeth's powers. These are usually either ammunition supplies accompanying any of a variety of guns, or big stationary freight hooks that you can latch onto with your skyhook so you can do a big, showy, gap-closing melee finisher move. Not that fight variety has ever really been BioShock's thing, but this does feel like it narrows things down even a little more. Even then, I tended not to use many of them by virtue of maining a very few guns and not caring much about the freight hooks except as navigation aids, but I suppose if it's going to be a bit more dynamic than the comparatively more methodical stuff you get in BioShock 1, having more constant access to guns would help as opposed to making resources more limited. Basically, I don't think the existence of this really affects the game too much in one direction or the other. The tears are one of those neutral things because it's at least more choices you can make, even if I think they aren't very valuable in most cases. Elizabeth's main contribution to fights tends to actually be her digging up either ammunition or vials of salts to replenish your mana, which she typically waits to do until you're in battle. Fine as a rule, but it definitely can make you feel a little nervous, and also end up in a place where you can't use possession on that vending machine to steal $10 from it. It's probably more of a challenge on higher difficulties, but this makes truly running out of resources a borderline impossibility at the lower levels, even for something as starved for capacity as the rocket launcher. This I actually will complain about because it makes the difficulty too swingy and reliant on Elizabeth's presence. One of the only two hard parts of the game for me was traversing Comstock House, when Elizabeth is not with you and in fact you're off to rescue her for, what, the third time this game? Hey everybody, it's the me who goes off script again. I ended up having to re-edit my warnings again because I made a mistake, and I realized that somehow I didn't talk about the climactic battles in either of these games, so let's take a moment to fix that. Each game has what I would consider two climactic battles, one of which being when you defeat the primary villain, and the second of which being a final fight sequence that you deal with in either game. In both games, you take out the primary villain in a cutscene. This is quite infamous in BioShock 1, where I think that it's a really transcendent use of the medium, and overall I think it's very good, and to say nothing about what the potential quality of a fight against Andrew Ryan might be like, if you actually had control, I think it would take away from the point of the game. Meanwhile, in BioShock Infinite, once again, Booker kills Comstock in a cutscene. This really just feels like it's there for the sake of cinematic parallelism, but on the other hand, I don't really think that a fight against Comstock would be very likely to be any good, so this is just an efficient way of cleaning that up. So both of these are quite good. Something else that both of these games share in common is the quality of their final battles. In BioShock 1, you fight against Fontaine, but Fontaine takes the form of this big muscly dude, and that's a choice, alright? Yeah, I think this just goes to prove what I had said before about I don't think Comstock would make a very good actual fight, and nor would Andrew Ryan. Yeah, needless to say, this battle gets the gas face. Getting it even harder, however, is the final boss, as such, of BioShock Infinite, which is a sort of tower defense, hold the line situation where you have to protect this generator from the Vox Populi. It's not exactly very fun, and also they give you control of the Songbird to use to attack larger targets, but that works very, very poorly. There's an escort mission section with a little sister in BioShock 1 right before that final boss, and I think I like that more. I don't really think anybody actually likes escort missions, so you can probably understand that I feel that that's a pretty damning statement. So, needless to say, neither of them really ends particularly well. No surprise that in both of these cases I prefer the original game, but the original idea of this video was supposed to be this sentiment that BioShock Infinite betrays BioShock in some way, and this is the place where BioShock Infinite, I feel, is almost the most like the original BioShock. With all of this said, and even with my seeming inability to even properly compliment something that made me feel a little stressed, I do have to give credit to BioShock Infinite for letting you change your equipment, more or less the equivalent to tonics in the original, on the fly without having to go to specific locations. This is an unequivocally good change that makes one far less likely to simply do one type of build than become complacent because they otherwise have to backtrack to change them. And we all know how much gamers love backtracking. They love it as much as they appear to love reading, which is why we have never seen this mechanic in any video game ever since. Sorry, I've just been around the Final Fantasy XIV fandom discussing Hermes recently. Okay, that should be all the gameplay talk. Let's deal with some writing and some narrative themes here. The original BioShock is at least a somewhat interesting exploration of player agency, regardless of its conclusions. Sure, the choices you make are not the most meaningful, and you will ultimately do the main plot anyway, but I think the game does a good job of making this into a major theme. Jack isn't much of a character, but among the few things that you actually know about him, one of them is that he is actually controlled by the phrase, "would you kindly?" It's a way of playing with why you seem to be unable to make any choices of your own in the narrative. Your character may or may not lack agency for the usual reasons of the limitations of a video game, something which affects any video game, but also directly because someone else has control over him. Jack actually has no free will. In a way, you lack agency as well, aside from the obvious, but you can just shut it off, that I assume is also the usual counter-argument to Spec Ops The Line, but saying this as a serious argument just makes you look like a total dullard who's so far out of their depth they may as well be going up to a poker table while not knowing a single poker hand. Good luck with your queen high, chucklenuts! The plot twist that Atlas is actually Fontaine is kind of mediocre, but it does have a lesson. Granted, it's not related to the topic at hand, but I don't know where else to put it. Fontaine shows that sometimes revolutionary movements get co-opted, infiltrated, and undermined. This seems like a pretty good thing to know, folks. The Little Sisters represent the most meaningful choice the game offers you, which is minor but still not horrible since it changes what ending you get. You can choose to save or kill them for differing rewards and, as said, endings. I don't find it to be well balanced from a gameplay rewards perspective, and even the most utilitarian motherfucker will probably find that you aren't exactly God's gift to murder even if you kill every little sister, and saving them is ultimately the path to better rewards and a better ending, but that's for plot people like me. Also, it just kinda makes me feel bad to kill them. Look at how upset they get when you kill their guardians. It kinda fucks me up a little. So I think this is a bit clunky, but still, that is a type of player choice, and while it's very thin, it does matter at least a little. The combination of these two seemingly disparate attributes is very odd, but it's one of the things that helps make the game so attractive to people studying the medium. Some guy wrote a piece to change the language we use in discussing games at a critical level on the back of this. Of course, Gaming Critique did not start in 2007 around the discussion of this game, but it definitely helped get things to heat up a little. On the other hand, BioShock Infinite's version of this completely sucks. These two games ultimately have the same message about player/character agency, which is that you really don't have much other than just refusing to play. Presentation makes all the hey, I'm just being told in my earpiece here that I've been legally obligated to insert an excruciatingly obvious and, frankly, maybe even a little tacky reference to war games here. Something about the boss of YouTube content getting something stuck in its craw or whatever. I didn't know cold, unfeeling artificial intelligences had craws for things to get stuck in, but I'm too drunk to ask questions. So, whatever. Not even gonna try anymore. Here you go.
Strange game. The only winning move is not to play.
Ha ha ha. What a wonderful pop cultural reference. I feel so cool because I am knowledgeable enough to have heard of a well-known film from the 1980s, and now everyone else who has knowledge of the subject can nod together with me, as we whisper our daily affirmations to ourselves. I know a piece of popular culture which inherently makes me smarter than everyone else who does not. Now, before we were so rudely interrupted, presentation makes all the difference, though. BioShock Infinite doesn't even try to make you think your choices matter. You have extremely few choices throughout the game, and none of them even attempt to look like they affect anything major. Early on, Booker wins a lottery drawing at a fair and is invited to engage in a public stoning of an interracial couple with a baseball. Which, first of all, if these hands were any heavier, they would collapse into miniature black holes and then dissolve due to Hawking radiation. But secondly, wow, this game really sets off with a bang, doesn't it? However, regardless of the choice you make, you're interrupted by a member of the crowd noticing a mark on your hand that signifies that Mr. Comstock warned of your arrival. I'm pretty sure this idea is a fairly typical time travel trope, where someone with an identifiable physical marking recognizes their older self because of retaining that marking. I think this is literally the plot of a Dream Theater song from 1989. Oh, by the way, Comstock is an older Booker. Spoilers, but I assume if you're watching this you don't care or you already know. If not, well, you should have heeded the warning early on. This changes nothing in the greater scheme. You can find the couple again later in the game where they thank you for saving them, and that's all, and I don't even remember if this changes depending on your choice. Primarily because you get interrupted before you can throw, and I haven't got the guts to try the other option. While the original BioShock at least is doing something interesting with the concept through a character who openly is deprived of his agency by forces far bigger than him in the plot, BioShock Infinite takes an approach I think I would call nihilistic on the matter of character agency in a way that is far more extreme than the original. Nothing weird is happening here. You are, in fact, completely normal. Circumstances notwithstanding, I mean. This was not true in BioShock 1. Jack is a laser-focused object lesson of a character who feels like he is abnormal. Booker is just a fool of the gods, funnily more of an everyman than the guy who almost lacks personality to build a much thinner layer of separation between player and character. This game doesn't just look at the concept and start a monologue about hearing good bunko and great bunko and deciding it goes above and beyond. It just frankly doesn't fucking care. But it doesn't fucking care very aggressively. It has to tell you it doesn't fucking care at every turn. Like a right-wing Twitter troll who is extremely and obviously aggrieved about Brisket being a girl despite never having played a Guilty Gear game. This is perhaps the closest I've seen to a game suggesting free will at the human level is not real. It's still pretty far from that, but hey, this game is no stranger to winning by beating the weakest field imaginable. What I think is the most interesting about this is that the nihilism on the subject of player choice in BioShock Infinite was also a theme of BioShock, but I think the original ends up actually seeming like it's trying to make a game where player choices matter. While Jack is utterly dispossessed of free will, I think that BioShock 1 feels more like an exploration of the idea. He is a purpose-built character who exploits these attributes dialed up to 11. The game could very well be saying that there is no such thing as free will for a video game character or in a video game, but it feels more like it's saying, ask yourself, do you actually have free will in your video game? Even if it's just a matter of tone, these two statements are absolutely worlds apart from each other. The overall narrative is linear, but you have different endings depending on whether you choose to kill or rescue the Little Sisters, and they fundamentally change how you build your character. I won't repeat the explanation. I'm saying this to underscore that this is an actual choice system that shows a way it has value which is tangible even to people who ignore the plot until they are forced to interact with it. It probably sounds like I'm saying one side of the scale is way too light here, but it's fine because we can actually talk about ideas of interplay between gameplay and narrative. In particular, if you wish to view gameplay as narrative itself, this lends itself to a pretty strong ludonarrative considering what I said earlier. This feels like too obvious of a read for me to say anything like, well, death of the author and all that to it. This explicitly feels like what Ken Levine was trying to do, and then nobody actually thought about it any and nothing about gaming changed, so he just said fuck it and made BioShock Infinite. Like, maybe it's just that I think this guy's a total jerk-off, which I'll get into later, but it just feels like he absolutely failed at his intent with the original game, and that's that, but he created something more interesting in the process. As you recall from earlier, Booker is actually a real character, while Jack isn't. Granted, Booker isn't much of a character beyond a bunch of implications, but the writers are trying to do something. I don't think this drastic gulf between the two characters is in any way bad, just different. For what it's worth, Booker being a real person instead of a borderline Afghan cap means that there is more room for the team to write a good story about him without breaking the concept. And if the quality isn't there, at least we have potential. And surely I'm not the only person who's attracted to things that have high potential in the interest of creating something more amenable to my tastes. When I finished streaming through BioShock Infinite, I said that I think he'd work much better if the game was about him and Elizabeth dealing with the various ways in which they should be messes. I mean, Elizabeth lived her whole life in a tower. She probably should have very poor social skills. And Booker is allegedly a guy whose many regrets, being an ex-Pinkerton who participated in 2 racially motivated mass slaughters, will weigh heavy on your soul provided you actually have one, to say nothing of selling your baby daughter, have left him a bit of a train wreck of a man. The idea of a story where they help each other become functional members of a hostile society would actually be kind of cute. Maybe without the incest angle? That was such a wild swerve. What the game presents us with starts out kind of jarring. When I first played BioShock Infinite, I was surprised by the fact that Booker is as much of a chatterbox as he is, and by BioShock standards, such as they existed, it feels abnormal. You could probably rake me over the coals for inventing standards for this franchise with so little to go off of, to be fair, and doubly so for feeling that every game in a series needs to feel the same, which I now feel is probably a bit silly. Booker is the most of a character out of the main game's playable characters, you know, if we set aside the DLC, and Columbia is decidedly way less lonely than Rapture ever is, not to mention Booker is constantly having actual conversations with Elizabeth, whereas Jack literally only has one line in the original game and mostly gets talked to, and less frequently than Booker and Liz talk. Credit where it's due, this does serve the monstrously stupid meta-narrative theme in one very specific way. It's harder to imprint upon an actual character, which forcibly distances you more from any choices you make in the narrative. And indeed, I like that there's something that differentiates the games if they were going to come to different conclusions on the same subject. Even if the intent wasn't to do something different between the two, well, the end result did not bear that out. Now, about the ending, since that's kind of infamous, surprisingly, I didn't remember it that well before my replay. I remembered there was some nonsense about multiple dimensions, parallel timelines, or some other pretentious twaddle that seemed to exist for the entire purpose of proving that the BioShock name is on this game for reasons other than the fact that 2K didn't feel confident about selling this game without tying it to something much bigger and more beloved. Elizabeth kills Booker prematurely to break the cycle of him becoming Comstock. Just so I don't breeze past it though, I think the attempt at a theme with the a man, a city, a lighthouse thing is kind of undercooked but trying a little bit too hard. I can't really tell to what end this is being done other than to create a self-contained multiverse, and it's done in such a sledgehammerish way that it makes me groan a little. It would genuinely be more likable if Elizabeth broke the fourth wall and explained it directly to me in words so small as to be veiled insults in of themselves, with bonus points if Booker just looked at her and went, "What the fuck are you talking about?" I suppose on some level though, this is a more interesting direction than BioShock 1 just because there's more of an idea here. It is, you might say, thought-provoking. Interesting and thought-provoking are such weirdly neutral terms that I think some folks just assume to be compliments, but I really like the idea of using them as backhanded remarks more. It doesn't have to be particularly smart in the end. If you dismiss it as a load of dingo's kidneys, didn't you think about it a little? Was it not thought-provoking? Couldn't it have been interesting? Anyway, the idea of comparing BioShock to Infinite in this Man-City Lighthouse paradigm feels a bit funky, if only because I don't think Booker is controlled to kill Comstock the way Jack is made to kill Ryan. Unless you want to assert that the player is Fontaine. Perhaps the idea doesn't need to extend itself further than the basic skeleton of this man-door, hand-hook, car door paradigm. But if it doesn't, this does feel a bit like the game is just explaining what a high concept is to the player, and I'm not that dull. Unlike BioShock, you only have one ending here. In interviews, Levine said he only wanted one ending in the original, too. If you're the sort of fellow who's actually looking to make a story and believes video games to be a storytelling medium, it is significantly less of a pain in the ass to make something with only one ending. especially if you might have to continue it one day. Which, if you're making a video game especially, is always a bit of a fear, isn't it? In any case, I don't think multiple endings or even choices of value are required for a video game, and this further ties into something I said earlier. Games in a series don't have to imitate each other structurally. The ending is ultimately fine. Not much more, but still fine. It also leads to a potentially hilarious idea of trying to identify various other pieces of literature as a BioShock, but I also find the idea of referring to anything as a or an, and then a proper noun which does not directly refer to them, to just be inherently funny. It's like calling someone a Shar, or how you have Jagans in the Fire Emblem series. All deeply and actively hilarious, even when they're actually useful explanations. What I did not remember was that the ending sequence begins with Elizabeth somehow ascending to a godlike level of power and getting a lot more serious with the destruction of Monument Island, because apparently breaking the siphon that was used on her brings her back up to full power, which I don't exactly believe makes sense, but whatever. Sense goes out the window at least halfway when we're dealing with what Elizabeth can do. This also leads to two major reveals. The first is that Elizabeth is Booker's daughter, Anna, and she's missing the end of one of her fingers because it was severed when one of Yukari Yakumo's gaps closed after she was taken away to Columbia. This produces a weird effect that I will talk about once we have no other distractions. The other big reveal is that Booker is Comstock from the past. This makes sense and all, and is a fair enough inference to make since we were previously shown Booker baptized and being asked for a new name as a born-again Christian. We can make the logical leap, and it's not as far as all that, but it is not how I remembered this reveal going. I remember Booker seeing the AD brand on his right hand on Comstock's right hand, which means that I hallucinated a more concrete ending than was actually there. Weird, I thought my memory would make this game seem worse, but not like this. My recollection is probably worse writing, but a stronger mental image. The scene of Booker looking at his own right hand and Comstock's, and you see both of their brands, seems like it looks real good in my brain, and video games are at least partially a visual medium. Having a few good shots every once in a while helps. The main thing that locks in that Booker is Comstock is, more or less, conservation of detail. Booker is Comstock because it doesn't make narrative sense for him to be someone you've never heard of in the story. The line of logic is easy enough to follow, but it's not necessarily concrete. It feels like it's missing exactly one tiny moment to stop you from thinking anything else. There's also something else that I find really distasteful about BioShock Infinite for reasons that aren't, these are literally only the politics of rich, soul-dead mercenary power fetishists, or the writer coming off like a racist scumbag, both of which I will get into, rest assured. No, this has to do with that girl you only remember because of internet porn. Don't try to deny it, folks. See, Elizabeth's character and plot arc does have something to it, some potential for substance, primarily in her relationships. Her relationship with the Songbird greatly resembles one with an abusive partner, with Elizabeth begging the Thing not to murder Booker horribly and promising she'll go along with it at one point. Throughout the game, Elizabeth builds a relationship with Booker, as in, I think the writers intended for players to ship these two. At least up until the ending, where it's revealed that actually Elizabeth is Booker's daughter, which he didn't realize because she's aged quite a lot since then, and we didn't realize because we didn't really have a way to. Springing the incestuous nature of this established relationship on the player suddenly raises a few questions. Now, I would certainly assume the point is that you're supposed to feel really gross about what you were feeling earlier. If this was not intended to make the average member of the audience disgusted or otherwise be an imposition to their shipping these two characters, I'll be shocked. So we'll set that option aside and assume that they're going for the more mainstream idea. We'll assume that this reveal is meant to be a ship-sinking moment, that you're supposed to feel your skin crawl a little when you realize they are father and daughter. Unfortunately, I really don't think this works. No, I'm sorry guys, but you did this on purpose and then expect me to feel bad about it? I'm afraid that dog won't hunt. This is just a plain weird approach. It's weird to spring incest on people like this at the end of something you are openly writing as a ship, unless that is the point. Also, you cannot goad someone into believing something seriously, then belittle them for believing it and expect them to respond positively to that. Or take you seriously for that matter. Elizabeth is a character that could truly only be made by a man, and I say that in the most derogatory way I possibly can. Elizabeth is a character that I would describe as being the superposition between being a strong, smart, independent woman and being an object to be desired and protected. She's helpful, clever, and very capable, but has no combative ability whatsoever, and starts off as a damsel in distress, who stays at least a little of that even after her rescue because of the pursuit of the songbird, even when it's out of focus. At least once, she even uses her terror ability and lands directly in the hands of the enemy, which at best makes her a damsel in distress with more steps, at least in that moment. She is aggressively weird and desperately needs saving from her home canon. However, if you want to apply what I'm pretty sure is a little death of the author, the ending is perhaps the place where the game is at its most in-your-face about the message you'd be expecting it to have. Elizabeth drowns Booker at a baptism, and not even metaphorically. As such, this can be taken as the time Booker is redeemed. So it's a very simple line to draw that a man with Booker's past, a Pinkerton who slaughtered at Wounded Knee and worked to quash the Boxer Rebellion, can be redeemed only in death at best. Deeply simplistic, but with how the game has spent so long priming you to not expect it to espouse any real ideology except that everyone is equally bad, it seems slightly out of character for this game, and it's fairly possible for it to whiz right past you. Also, it probably is a little late in the game for it to be putting this forward since we dealt with that part of Booker's character about 6 hours ago. So we'd better get into that part, right? I keep mentioning this huge problem with BioShock Infinite, about how it actively doesn't want to say almost anything. Well, hold up, because I have a few comparisons to make along the way first. This is where I think we start to get into the story matters that could be considered a betrayal. Again, using that over-the-top word because I think it's funny. Both games feature overtly political aspects, but with different targets. BioShock Infinite does have one very specific take that I can agree with immediately, which is that it thinks American exceptionalism is a bad belief. Which it is. The original BioShock was openly inspired by the nonsensical ideologies of Ayn Rand. Okay, so it's time to dig into some embarrassing bits of my younger years. When I was a teenager, I, of my own free will, read 2 of Ayn Rand's pieces of literature. I was a huge Rush fan, and, knowing that Rand's novella Anthem inspired their epic 2112, I found a copy of Anthem in my school library. See, Anthem actually doesn't suck to read. While it thematically is about the power of the individual, it isn't so hardcore on this theme that I would call it a work in favor of individualism, rather one that is pro-individuality. There's a drastic difference that many people seem to not get, or sure act like they don't. Rather than selfishness and ego, Anthem's main ideological thrust seems to be in favor of people forging their own identities, something which would be a hell of a lot easier to accept as the case in a vacuum, but I digress. If the point is indeed in favor of selfishness and the ego, it at bare minimum hides it behind some other very reasonable things, and you can read Anthem while thinking about it significantly less than in any of her other monuments to graphomania. Consequently, I became kind of interested in her works and ended up picking up a copy of The Fountainhead. At the time, I believe I found it to be pretty interesting as a pure piece of fiction if it had no philosophical underpinnings, but at least I had the good sense to understand that her ideas of objectivism, which mostly boil down to selfishness attempting to be expressed as a political and philosophical ideology, were a load of dingo's kidneys and simply did not work in the real world because society is all about collaboration, and if everyone was as much of an egotistical piss baby as any of the characters in it were, and in the particular ways they were, society would collapse in on itself because nobody would be able to engage in collaborative effort. I think I wrote something like that for an attempt at earning a scholarship from an organization that I believe was called the Ayn Rand Society. No surprise I didn't get that scholarship, but in retrospect, maybe having won a scholarship from an Ayn Rand Society might have been a pretty severe mark against me. For reference, I have since also read part of Atlas Shrugged. I couldn't get through it because it was getting a little too high off its own supply, but you can get the point by looking at the sheer size and going, of course her ideology is selfishness and egomania that she has feebly tried to parlay into a philosophy. If it wasn't, she would believe in editors and this fucking house brick would be at least a smidge leaner. If you want to go insane, read some things that Rand has said about a certain sequence involving sexual assault in the novel. That is all I will say on that one. I also since gave my copy of The Fountainhead to my mom to use as an anvil of sorts for hammering eyelets into pieces of costumes back when she used to try to make stuff to sell at Renaissance fairs, and it was significantly better at that than it was as a book. Still, I was kind of fascinated by this incredibly bad person and her philosophically unsound works, so that was one of the things that made me want to get BioShock in the first place. Not to mention this obscenely badass robot with a drill arm on the cover. Advertising matters, folks, and I have always loved mecha series, which is what I immediately thought the Big Daddy looked like it came from. No, as a teenager, I really couldn't place offhand that it was an old-timey diving suit. Personally, I blame the drill. While BioShock does deal with some of Rand's ideologies, it more broadly deals with the American brand of libertarianism, which also mostly boils down to selfishness attempting to be expressed as a political and philosophical ideology. It's the same thing the Republican Party at large believes, but with fewer instances of openly blaspheming against the Christian Trinity despite parading themselves around as the holiest of men, which feels odd because I feel like all the American libertarians I've met have also been way into new atheism, and being a lot less cagey about how much its proponents like smoking weed and fucking. Some of the game's jabs are more overt than others. Obviously, Rapture is falling apart and is maintained like shit due to the lack of regulatory oversight and everyone just doing what they think is right, i.e. acting solely in self-interest. Rapture is populated by particularly disturbing individuals, like Dr. J.S. Steinman, who gives people all kinds of horrifying plastic surgeries to make them conform to his completely bonkers idea of what constitutes beauty, which he believes it is a moral imperative to pursue, like some kind of ridiculous version of utilitarianism. Or Sander Cohen, a mad artist whose masterwork includes the murder of several rivals and whose domain is populated by what appear to be statues, but are actually just various splicers with a coating of plaster over their entire bodies, still perfectly capable of moving around. They all act according to their self-interest in the extreme. But more subtly, you can find certain areas where vending machines' prices are way off the standard. During the course of an interview with Rock Paper Shotgun, apparently Ken Levine expressed what the interviewer called sympathy for the ideology of Ayn Rand, although the exact content was clipped out of the RPS interview. Makes me wonder if he realized what game he made or not, but also, this scans. Levine in general feels like a libertarian, though I can't remember if he's made any particular statement on the matter. This statement is based entirely on vibes. BioShock Infinite does not carry on in the first game's footsteps, but that's hardly a problem at all. Devoting an entire franchise to dunking on one comparatively narrow ideology would probably be overkill. On paper, this is actually a strength, and I suppose in reality it sort of is, but it winds up just being sort of neutral. See, BioShock Infinite is not good at what it seems like it wants to do, and that has nothing to do with whether or not it's in the BioShock series. Aside from the fact that its bland meta-narrative message is accomplished in a bland way, it is also a game that truly does not say anything useful on the political front. I don't need my games to be political, obviously, but if you start posturing like your game is political, you need to say something more than, "This fence is comfy," or "Nah, I was just kidding," or your writing is going to look bad. Even when it tees itself up for it, the game is so bad at actually sticking the landing that I'm led to wonder what anyone involved here thinks, or if they even do. About a quarter of the way through the game, you can find a museum section about Comstock's supposed stolen valor regarding the Wounded Knee Massacre and the Boxer Rebellion, which, of course, is only perceived as stolen valor by Cornelius Slate, who's showing Booker visions of their own past to try to show that the two of them were real men's men who committed horrifying acts of racist violence because of racism, because Slate doesn't know that Booker is Comstock, which becomes this weird form of dramatic irony once you figure it out. How can Comstock steal his own valor? However, the game stops short of actually saying what it thinks unless you count the thing at the end. It's deeply bizarre just how much this game is disinterested in having a message, because it is extremely in your face about just how much it entirely rightly thinks racism is bad. It just never quite manages to actually say it, and not even in what I'd call a you figure it out for yourself sort of way, because of how it fumbles the ball when handling very specific events. Just because I don't need someone to tell me that what happened in those locations is fucked up, doesn't mean that someone coming into this thinking racism is cool actually will be given a reason to think otherwise here, and might take away a different message. I think some of this is also diffused slightly by having just regular background people, for example in Battleship Bay, who are just openly racist but not in a violent way, so it might whiz right past you if you're not paying attention. Folks, I think we found the most perfectly formed example of radical centrism possible, using a nascent art form to both sides revolution, political violence, the Wounded Knee Massacre, the Boxer Rebellion, and the motherfucking Pinkertons, while the idea of the medium being taken as capable of meaning is so new that there are scarcely any prominent art critics around to say how much a piece that says that sucks the shit directly out of a pigeon's asshole, and not many things they could easily point to as the proof that it does without getting getting confused or, perhaps worse, hostile responses. I know it's very easy to dunk on video game critics, and historically, that's been perpetrated by some people with very toxic opinions. But in this case, many people in the field got played like total marks. Even so, most of my anger remains directed at Kenny for making something like this. This is a game that specifically appeals to people who are saying the phrase alt-left until Donald Trump said it, and then had to give it its burn notice, not because they had really changed their minds about leftist ideology, but solely because Orange Man bad. And yes, Orange Man very bad, but grow some principles, would ya? It gets worse though. A few years back, in a time when Twitter was owned by a regular Nazi and not a turbo-Nazi, in a conversation, Ian Danskin, the presenter of YouTube channel Innuendo Studios, noted that Ken Levine at some point said he thought oppressed people invariably turn into oppressors when they get any amount of power. Yikes. So if we assume that to be accurate to his feelings, it explains a lot about BioShock Infinite. Not just how something like this could come about, but it puts Daisy Fitzroy being a woman of color in a worse, just so much worse light. Say for the sake of argument, we're in a position where it would be a bad look for us to just assume. Well, thankfully, we don't have to just assume. I found this interview in Rolling Stone, originally from Glixel, where he explains the following in response to a question about race and Daisy turning evil when Vox Populi have power. I quote, "Here's what I'd say. BioShock 1 is about Jews. I'm a Jew. If you think about it, Andrew Ryan, Sander Cohen, Tenenbaum, they're all Jews. Suchong is Korean. During World War II, Korea was brutally occupied by Japan. He's a guy who survived. They're all survivors of oppression, and they don't come out of it as heroes. Oppression turns them into oppressors. And that's the cruelest aspect of oppression. If you look at Andrew Ryan and Daisy Fitzroy, they're not that far apart." Holy fuck, man. I had a joke here about, well, I guess he was the one who named his studio Irrational Games or something, but I'm not really sure this is truly a good place for it because this statement just sounds just incredibly racist. Yes, here's about where the original concept of this video goes up in smoke. This could have been a real story in theory if Ken had just left it as a generic matter of power corrupting. But he speaks very pointedly here of these being oppressed people and that being why they became who they did. It is a recurring theme. It's not that power corrupts. That pointedly is not what BioShock is about in this man's imagining. It's very specifically about how oppressed people will find someone to oppress in turn if they get power. He explicitly says that this is a recurring theme further down in his answer. You have to strain very hard to give this man the benefit of the doubt with this one, because I'm afraid I can't imagine a version of this premise where the conclusion doesn't involve something deeply horrible. Speaking, perhaps doubly, of recurring themes, let me indulge my reads the comments sections a little too often syndrome here real quick and point out that no, not all revolutions are good, not even comparatively. And that's a fair statement to make, but unfortunately, it feels like it's more buttressed by a very particular recurring theme in BioShock, wherein Frank Fontaine's whole bag is that he's abusing his appearance of being a man of the people in order to gain power. And he is far from the only one. Nobody in BioShock acts in an altruistic way. Combine this with how Daisy Fitzroy is depicted, and it does sort of project this image that the series is trying to promote that everyone who seems to want to help the people tends to end up being a bit of a grifter. Once again, there is a world of difference between altruism is rare and anyone who pretends to be altruistic is a grifter. Now, if you were being charitable, which I really don't want to do right now, you could probably look at this as being some very poorly expressed way of saying that it's in human nature to punch down. This sentiment is debatable, which is more than I can say about my read of it, but that is worlds apart from the exact words used here. This is making Ken Levine kind of look like he sucks at interviews, which I suppose is better than the conclusions that I came from in my own read, but still, in a case like that, you really want to be very careful with your words. Nevertheless, I'm going right back to taking him at face value with the exact words that he said, which are real bad. I think you figured that one out, though. Another problem is how much of this seems to be rooted in the extremely violent methods of everyone on display. The founders are horrifically violent. Even if we exclude the entirety of the narrative before Booker gets on that rowboat, you know, back when Booker was a Pinkerton, Comstock is a man who has built a brutal state full of horrid, religiously justified violence, and we get to see plenty of it just hanging out in the background. The Vox Populi are extremely violent and frequently go way too far, often doing utterly useless things. Daisy Fitzroy coming dangerously close to killing an innocent child because of some misguided ideology is the most famous, but there's a lot of violence for violence's sake involved. And it is this violence specifically that is frequently called attention to. There's a lot of weirdness about how this all goes down, but fine. I'd prefer a solution to the many problems in the world that involves less bloodshed over one with more bloodshed any day of the week, provided they both fix things. I think most of us would. The problem, even outside of saying that both sides are equally bad because it ignores a lot of things, is that little bugbear of ludonarrative dissonance coming up again. I talked about Clint Hawking's article that coined the phrase in a previous video, but I think BioShock Infinite has it worse. How, game, can you expect me to think violence is flatly a bad thing when I'm playing as a guy who not only can kill wild amounts of people, but has to get through the game, and in fact is even sometimes otherwise rewarded for even some of the more needless murders? Booker DeWitt, just in Columbia and not counting Comstock, accumulates a truly wild body count for one man. It takes any bite out of the game's messaging, and I don't think my interpretation of the ending can save this one either. If you want this kind of morality, forget about this, go play Off! Honestly, even saying that is kind of major spoilers for Off, but I promise the journey to reach that point is worth it. I hear the new remaster version that's now on Switch and Steam is quite good if you're allergic to old software. However, before I continue, I want to go back to the ending and once again bring up the interpretation I arrived at. I dug through a couple of interviews with Ken Levine and didn't find anything on this particular point. Mostly this makes me feel like I didn't read enough of them, but now I'm actually curious if this was intentional or if I am drawing my own conclusions here. Is this what we're supposed to think and everyone just fumbled the ball, or are we not expected to draw this conclusion and assume that the ending is only very literally about Booker being killed to break the cycle of what he would perpetuate as Comstock? I have no idea, but I'll tell you this much. When I played the game near release, I did not consider this. At bare minimum, if this is the intended message, I can't begrudge people for not getting it, not just because I didn't get it, but this feels oddly thin, because Booker still commits truly unnecessary amounts of murder along the way, even as he espouses beliefs that violence is bad, while never analyzing his own actions in any way. If I have to spend this much time second-guessing your message, you did a bad job at communicating it. There's something very, very weird in the Rock Paper Shotgun interview that Ken Levine says that has thrown me off pretty severely throughout the majority of this video. In discussing how he conceived of the setting of Rapture, he says the following, quote, "I don't start with story because games are not story. Games are gameplay, games are interactive." But later on, he also talks extensively about the amount of storytelling that he's doing, and in fact, in the very last question reproduced in the RPS interview, he says, "I'm trying to make a video game which allows me to concentrate on the storytelling capacity of video games," and a series of other words that are mostly in the context of not wanting video games to turn into movies. This is a prime example of how I just cannot figure out what exactly Ken's angle is. Because,
even without that second answer,
it is simply objectively untrue that video games are not story. Perhaps what he's saying is that he doesn't value ludonarrative elements, which is a philosophy that I know quite a few people subscribe to. I personally think it to be bozo shit, we're not here for that part. Unfortunately, I simply cannot say, so I am stuck making the assumption that even though he is using games as a storytelling medium here, he still kind of believes that games aren't good at this sort of thing, which is nonsense. I'm sorry, dog, but video games are story. They had literally been story for decades when you released BioShock, because that's what RPGs are, numbskull. You think all Dragon Quest was some dorks pushing around numbers and being happy with how nakedly it was that compared to every other video game? Bull, and if I may be so bold, shit, my man. While showing items in shops while making them unavailable to players is a type of game design, it is also an important piece of the narrative, because there is a narrative there. You are unable to buy those things for a reason. And in the world of BioShock, there is every reason to believe that it's because some opportunist is aiming to hurt you for fun. It is of course not a problem to have this, but Levine not recognizing it for what it is utterly boneheaded. Look, remember in Chrono Trigger when the new at Zeal Palace wouldn't sell you silver weapons, or load weapons as they were called in the original translation, until you came through during your second run through? That's the exact same kind of ludonarrative consonance. Actually, can I just take a second to discuss this translation, because if I keep talking about Kenny for too long, my head's gonna explode. While the term lode is probably most immediately considered to be related to lodestone, referring to naturally metallic minerals, most often magnetite, a lode can refer to any rich vein of a typically very precious metal. Among the more famous named lodes in American history is a silver lode known as the Comstock lode, discovered in Nevada in 1859. Which is just a funny bit of coincidence. I'm pretty sure this game's Comstock is named after Anthony Comstock, a postal inspector and hater of what he deemed to be obscene media, so ravenous in his assault on such things that it led to an eponymous term, Comstockery, meaning the censorship of media based on particularly broad definitions of what constitutes obscenity, also known as what Collective Shout and other evangelical lunatics are trying to do to gaming as a medium, and no doubt what the Trump administration will try someday. There's also, Half-Life, a game that I said earlier that it feels like BioShock is openly trying to ape with its immersive world building and near lack of zero-control cutscenes. I will perhaps at some point have to talk about how ultimately a lot of games probably just want to be Half-Life, but this style of reasonably immersive and, more important, narratively dense, especially for 1998, first-person action-adventure story is a strong, perhaps perfect, counterexample to this very weird statement on behalf of Ken Levine. Strangely enough, in the Glixel interview, Levine has a different take. Instead, he says that he's perceived games as having weight and meaning, which in context suggests stories worth telling, since as far back as Castle Wolfenstein on the Apple II. And I think it's fair to assume from this wording that he means he played it back when it was new. This comes off like two versions of the same story on the part of Kenny Boy, not character development, unless he had just forgotten during the 2000s, only to remember sometime around when work on BioShock Infinite started, oh, right, Wolfenstein! Somehow, I don't think that's terribly likely. If I wish to be charitable, which, hey, may as well once or twice in this endeavor, I would assume that Ken always thought that and told RPS the load of blood-boiling bullshit I mentioned earlier because he didn't think anyone else thought like him, until he started to catch wind of all of the critics examining BioShock as a serious piece of narrative art. Which means I'm still going to come out of this not liking what he said back then, because he was in a good position to put forward his seemingly unique ideas, but at least we can take it as an explanation. Additionally, the concept of an interactive narrative medium is something that has been well established, whether that be something as simple as a choose-your-own-adventure novel, or very basic fourth wall breaks of the type I discussed back in my Eternal Darkness video, as written about in Hamlet on the Holodeck by Janet Murray, or something a little more sophisticated. For a fairly modern example, in Rupert Holmes' musical adaptation of Dickens' unfinished novel The Mystery of Edwin Drood, the audience decides the ending by a vote. Yes, that Rupert Holmes, by the way. I don't think any trapped miners have to resort to cannibalism in Edwin Drood, but I am no expert on the subject. The idea of calling narrativity and interactivity mutually exclusive the way Levine seemed to be implying here is simply wrong and to a maddening extent. It's hard to make a game where one's choices truly matter because there is a lot of overhead involved there. It's also totally fine to not have any real choices, but this game is something else. It dangles the concept of choices with important effects in front of you while never actually making your choices amount, in the long run, to anything more than a blue bandage around DeWitt's right hand, a few graphics you will probably notice even less, and maybe some tiny optional pieces of dialogue that don't put anything on the scale. Perhaps above all, I'm most frustrated simply by not seeing how all this adds up across years of conflicting interviews of the same man, leaving me unable to figure out his angle. In a prior video, I described Ken Levine as resembling a less tasteful David Cage. Maybe some of that sentiment was born of frustration, but I say it because it seems abundantly clear that, much like David Cage, Ken Levine thinks he's doing something, but he's pretty far out of his depth when it comes to this part of the medium, so it makes him come off like a buffoon. It's pretty incredible how one of the major minds behind both System Shock 2 and Thief the Dark Project ends up clowning on himself with this one. But if you want more unhinged bits that would be fun to quote out of context, I feel like their interests sync up in a surprising way. David Cage, being the metaphorical doppelganger of Hideo Kojima, is a known film fan who wants to incorporate some of that energy into his games, while Ken really seems to want us to feel the same. Which is weird to say because he says the opposite quite frequently. Unfortunately, the results bear out otherwise. One of the many random and possibly irrelevant things I never mentioned is how Elizabeth really wants to go to Paris for reasons that we are left to relate to film after we see her open its hair to an 80s Paris playing an alternate universe Return of the Jedi with a name George Lucas had originally thought of giving the film Revenge of the Jedi. But French because it's in France. See, I have this really unhinged take about Elizabeth that I won't get into here because it absolutely does not fit in with this video essay. But for those of you who want to have a little bit of fun, I will post it as a Patreon extra for those of you who want to blah blah blah, give me your money, this took way too much effort, holy fuck. BioShock Infinite is the most nihilistic game I've ever played, but very specifically on a meta level. BioShock Infinite isn't necessarily dim in its perspectives on humanity, history, or politics, though it has its moments fueled by some aggressively bad takes, but on video games as a narrative medium. It is a game that is almost obsessed with driving home the futility of the medium, and ultimately even of itself. I think the last time I encountered a game this self-defeating was Little Inferno. For those of you who haven't played it, Little Inferno is a game about just burning everything. You just put things into a fireplace and burn them. Ultimately, it conveys the message that spending your life just playing games is a waste and you should go outside. I thought this was kind of mean-spirited at the time I played it, but that's besides the point, really. It's that the message very specifically is that this is a waste of your time and energy. Many games are nakedly a waste of time. I just recently played through Space Quest for the first time in nearly 15 years, and since I forgot to get the magnetic widget on my first try, the slot machine section required actually save scumming through an RNG gate. For Little Inferno, it's the self-defeating nature of the beast. And I mean, what do you want me to say? Maybe it is, but if you tell me that playing video games is a waste of time, then naturally I am going to look at what you've created and say it's a waste of time too. It feels like the equivalent of saying nothing will fundamentally change. Joe Biden, the video game. But at least that's a message! BioShock Infinite believes in nothing and is pretty dang proud of it. It emphatically believes in nothing, even. It's the null rod of video games. It doesn't not believe in anything, it believes in nothing. I hate it with practically my entire being, but I can't help but be fascinated by just how grimly self-effacing it is. Unfortunately, the same cannot be said for what little else the game does say, which is so awful that it effectively neutralizes any potential fascination that could have come out of the other part for any reason. So, because I'm the exact sort of person who would see someone trip over their own dick so badly that I just have to see the next thing they try to do, the pump is already primed for me to be horribly fascinated by Levine's next project, Judas, which he claims will incorporate a fairly unique storytelling mechanic. This from a guy whose most famous works of the last couple decades end up looking hostile to the concept of video games as storytelling media. And yes, I know, I'm also saying that I'm primed to be interested in the release version of the new game by a guy whose projects infamously live in development hell for long enough and leave enough on the cutting room floor to make at least a whole other game out of each. Anyway, I think he's been calling it narrative Legos or something, which I admit nowadays, the only Lego stuff I mess with is Technic and occasionally trying to build Bionicle-style mocks, which is probably not the visual he has in mind, as much as the phrase narrative gear ratio that popped into my brain as a result is funny. I can't imagine I'll actually want to play it, since a part of me kind of wants to give up entirely on newer technology, and is frankly about a year and a half away from going shit crazy and smashing anything with copper in it with a big brick, but barring that, well, okay, I probably still would avoid it anyway. But I have a certain morbid curiosity about it. Once again, I'm trapped in the cycle of being fascinated by an author whose works I consider to be of questionable quality and philosophically unsound. Time is a flat circle. I know I didn't talk about the Burial at Sea DLC duology, but admittedly, I've never played those. Together, they seem to me like they're big enough to be their own game. The BioShock 4 some people have been waiting for, but not the one that I think I recall 2K promising with or without Ken and Irrational. I will likely get to them one day, but it'll be a bit. But also, since they were not available at the time of launch and the original game was not specified as episodic, I think it's extremely fair to consider them a separate thing, worth being considered as a standalone title, and not strictly a part of their host game. Blah blah blah, you get the picture. Just wait, I'll get there. One day. Maybe. Oh my god, it's finally done. I'm so sorry, everybody, for keeping you waiting for so long, especially when I kept talking about how this was going to be the thing I was going to do, and I spent like 2.5 months doing this. There were even quite a few periods of time where I did not get out the usual video per month that I claimed that I try to put out there. It was kind of embarrassing, really. So let's try to never bring that up again. Okay, good. Now that we've got that part out of the way, I am very glad that I waited to record this until I got my SM58 and my cheap little desk, even though that thing is kind of a pain in the butt. I like the overall sound quality of this now. There's a few moments where I could make it sound better, but I'll get there with experience, and you can tell that I probably got a little tired of re-recording some of those moments because some of them definitely still leaked into the video. Anyway, thank you all for watching. I hope that at least some parts of this were enjoyable. If you would like to help the channel, you can like the video, leave a comment, subscribe, click on the bell so that you get notified when new videos come out. Also, yeah, like practically everybody on this website, I have a Patreon, patreon.com/lunariandelia. Head on over there, give however much money per month that you are able if you wish. You get access to videos a couple days early. There are some bonus fun things over there. While I was working on this video, I opened up a side channel for some other videos. You can find a link to that in the description. Also, I stream on Twitch, twitch.tv/lunariandelia. I currently do that every weekday at 7 p.m. Central Daylight Time. Yeah, it's still Daylight Savings right now. When Daylight Savings Time ends, that will revert to Central Standard Time, but it will probably still be at the same times unless there's a change of schedule. For now, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, I play a main game, a main series for the channel, and Thursday and Friday, I play various randomizers. Lately, it's been a lot of Ocarina of Time randomizers, but there's all kind of stuff that I can put into those positions. Anyway, for now, thank you all for watching. Oh, I'm so glad to be done with this.